My daughter tried to steal my multi-million-dollar home right after my husband's funeral. She isolated me and tricked me into signing papers, thinking I was just a confused, grieving widow who was too weak to fight back. For weeks, I was a prisoner in my own house while she and her husband schemed to take everything my husband and I had spent our lives building, believing their plan was perfect and I was completely powerless. But what they didn't know was that my brilliant husband had left me one last gift, a single envelope with a secret that would destroy their entire world in a single night. And I was about to open it. You know, the Pacific Ocean from our living room window used to be my comfort. It was this vast, calming presence, especially in the late afternoon when the sun would turn it into a sheet of hammered silver. But after we lost Harold, it just felt empty, indifferent. It was only 3 weeks after the funeral, and his house felt impossibly large and quiet. My daughter Freya seemed determined to fill the silence with a nervous energy that set my teeth on edge. She was constantly fussing with things, fluffing pillows that were already perfect, her movements quick and sharp. She kept telling me that I just needed to rest, that she and her husband Dean had everything under control. Her voice was always a little too bright, too loud, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as me. Dean was a different kind of presence. He spent most of his time by the big panoramic window, his back to me, with his phone practically glued to his ear. He wasn't admiring the view Harold had been so proud of. He was pacing his expensive loafers, making no sound on the marble floors. For that whole week, they were like a pair of wardens in my own home. It started subtly. I'd try to call one of my neighbors just to hear a familiar voice, and the call wouldn't go through. Then my old friend Carol, bless her heart, dropped by with one of her famous chicken casseroles. I saw her car pull up, and my heart lifted for a moment, but Freya intercepted her at the door. I could hear the murmur of their voices. Freya's full of this practiced, syrupy sympathy, explaining that I was simply too overwhelmed for visitors. It wasn't about protecting me. I knew that in my gut. It was about cutting me off, building a wall around me as quiet and relentless as the tide eating away at the cliffs below. The real betrayal. The moment that cut through the fog of my grief happened on a Tuesday. I was sitting at Harold's old oak desk, just running my hand over the wood, when Freya came in with a small stack of papers. She was all breezy efficiency, telling me it was just some standard estate paperwork. She said it was to make things easier so they could manage the utilities and property taxes for me. She pointed to a line at the bottom of a page, telling me to sign right there. I was so tired. Grief is a physical thing. It's like a heavy cloak you can't take off. I remember seeing words like authorization and management, but they didn't really register. In that moment, looking at my daughter's face, I chose to trust her. I picked up the pen, the very same one Harold used to sign the blueprints for our home, and I wrote my name. The smile Freya gave me wasn't one of comfort. It was pure, unadulterated relief, and it sent a chill right through me. That night, they left to attend some charity gala, giving me my first moment of real quiet since they'd descended upon the house. I was trying to sleep, but it was that shallow, restless kind of sleep you get when your heart is broken. Sometime after midnight, a sound pulled me into full awareness. It was Dean's voice coming from the guest bedroom down the hall. He'd left the door ajar, and his voice was a harsh, panicked whisper that sliced through the stillness. I got out of bed and crept into the hallway, my heart pounding a slow, cold rhythm against my ribs. He was on the phone, and what he was saying made the blood freeze in my veins. He was telling someone that they didn't understand that a 7-day grace period was ending on Friday. He needed, and I remember his exact words, the liquidity from the asset transfer, now. He said if he couldn't show movement, someone was going to call the note and they would be ruined. There was a pause, and then he said the words that would change everything. "Don't worry about Freya's mother. The papers are signed. She has no idea." By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there staring into the darkness, Dean's panicked words echoing in my mind. The shock slowly solidified into something cold and hard anger. Harold had spent his life building a legacy, a home, a family. And in 3 short weeks, our daughter and her husband were trying to burn it all down to pay for their mistakes. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since the funeral. My grief was still there, a constant ache in my chest, but now it was a whetstone, sharpening my resolve. Freya was already at the kitchen island mapping out what she called a grief-friendly brunch on her tablet. Her condescending tone about the healing properties of organic kale was enough to make my blood boil. Dean was on the patio, his back to us, pacing with his phone pressed to his ear again. The sheer amateurishness of it all was insulting. Did they really think I was that fragile that blind Harold would have seen through this charade in a second? In that moment, I decided I wouldn't just grieve him. I would honor him by being just as sharp. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hand perfectly steady, and waited for the right moment. Freya was in the middle of a lecture about avoiding processed sugars when I made my move. I kept my voice calm and even, calling out to Dean on the patio. He turned a flash of irritation in his eyes at being interrupted. I told him I'd just been on the phone with our insurance agent, a complete lie, of course. I said the agent had mentioned something about a related party transfer needing a secondary signature for liability purposes, and I asked so innocently if our lawyer had mentioned that to him. It was a total fabrication, a single stone tossed into their murky little pond, but the ripples were immediate and spectacular. Dean's face went completely white. He shot a look of pure panic at Freya, whose lecture on wellness choked in her throat. She started stammering, saying no, the lawyer had said it was a standard power of attorney. Dean immediately jumped in, his voice strained, trying to correct her, saying she meant the property management forms, that it was totally different. They just stood there looking at each other, their pathetic lies colliding in midair. The kitchen, which moments before had been filled with Freya's nonsense, was now crackling with their shared terror. And in that moment of clumsy, contradictory panic, I had all the confirmation I needed. They spent the rest of the day in a frenzy, whispering into their phones and shooting me anxious glances. Their control tightened into a stranglehold. Suddenly, my iPad was stuck in an update that never seemed to finish. The landline they claimed with false sympathy was having line trouble. They thought they were cutting me off from the world, sealing me inside my gilded cage. But they had forgotten who my husband was. Harold was a man who believed in contingencies and redundancies. While they were busy trying to patch the gaping holes in their sinking ship, I went into the pantry. Tucked away in an old shoebox was an emergency cell phone Harold had insisted we keep fully charged. I made one call. It was to a man whose loyalty to my husband was absolute, David Chen Harold's corporate lawyer for 30 years. I kept my voice quiet and steady, telling him my name and that we had a problem. The atmosphere in the house grew heavy with their fear. Their fake smiles were stretched so thin they were practically transparent. Their smothering care now felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. They were no longer just a pair of greedy, foolish children. They were exposed, and that desperation made them dangerous. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for a house or for Harold's company. I was fighting for my freedom. David's advice over the encrypted line was simple and wise: do nothing. Let them think they'd won. Let them get comfortable. So that's what I did. I put on the performance of a lifetime. I let them see exactly what they wanted to see: a grieving widow, confused, defeated, and frail. The next morning, I complained of a splitting headache and retreated to my bedroom. For 2 days, I barely left my bed, allowing Freya to bring me trays of bland, restorative food she probably read about on some wellness blog. Their relief was so thick, I could feel it from down the hall. They thought my little outburst in the kitchen had been a momentary scare, a brief crisis that was now over. In their minds, the old woman had folded, retreated into her grief, and the situation was firmly back under their control. Their arrogance, just as David predicted, became their undoing. Thinking I was napping, they grew careless and spoke more freely. Their whispers were no longer quite whispers. I heard them on a call with a real estate agent, the kind that specializes in high-end properties. They were discussing a pocket listing, a way to sell the house quickly and quietly without it ever hitting the open market. Later, I heard Dean in the hallway, his voice a low, desperate plea to someone on the phone. He was practically begging, promising just a few more days. He told the person on the other end that they had access to the primary asset, describing it as a 7-figure property on the PCH that was as good as gold. He was talking about my home. His voice was dripping with a fear he couldn't quite conceal. While they schemed, I prepared. At night when they were asleep, I got to work. Harold had been a meticulous man, a man who believed in contingency plans for his contingency plans. In the back of his walk-in closet, behind a false panel in the cedar lining that I hadn't thought about in 20 years, was a small safe. It took me a while to remember the combination. Our anniversary played backward. Inside wasn't jewelry or stacks of cash, but documents. Old blueprints, the original deeds to the house, and a single thick manila envelope with my name, Thelma, written in his familiar, steady hand. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, but I didn't open it. Not yet. Tucked beside it was a small, leather-bound book. I recognized it immediately. It was his private ledger, a meticulous record of personal loans and private investments assets, completely separate from the company and our official estate. Assets Freya and Dean knew nothing about. The final piece of the puzzle fell into my lap because of Freya's absolute conviction that she had won. She grew so careless, she left her laptop open on the dining room table while she went out to get us organic juices. A single email was visible on the screen. It was a final notice from a company called Prestige Asset Recovery. The subject line was a punch to the gut. Final demand for payment $1.8 million. My eyes scanned the body of the email, and I saw an attachment, a prospectus for a company called Innovest Future Tech, a fund that promised the kind of impossible returns that should scream scam to anyone with an ounce of sense. And just like that, I understood everything. This wasn't a simple, ugly story of greed. This was a story of desperation. They were in a catastrophic financial hole and they were panicking. They weren't just trying to get rich off their grieving mother. They were trying not to drown. I spent the morning in a state of quiet focus. I now knew everything. The what, the why, and thanks to Harold, I held the how in my hands. David and I had spoken again on the emergency phone, and the plan was set. All I had to do was wait for the clock to strike 11. The doorbell rang at precisely 11 a.m. Freya, who was arranging a vase of funereal white lilies with a look of intense concentration, sighed in annoyance. She muttered something under her breath about telling Carol we weren't having visitors. But it wasn't Carol. When a reluctant Dean opened the door, he was met by the calm, unshakable presence of David Chen. David stood there in a perfectly tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase, his expression one of serene and absolute authority. Dean just stammered David's name, his face losing all its color. He asked what David was doing here. David didn't wait for an invitation. He walked right past him into the foyer as if he owned the place, which in a legal sense he almost did. He simply stated that I had asked him to stop by, as we had some documents to review regarding Harold's estate. That was my cue. I walked down the grand staircase, holding the small, leather-bound ledger in my hand. My voice was steady when I told Freya and Dean to please join us in the living room. The air was thick with tension. David placed a single official-looking document on the coffee table. He explained that it was a notice of an emergency board meeting for Sterling Construction. As Harold's executor and the majority shareholder, I had called for a vote to install a new CEO. Then David locked his eyes onto Dean. He informed him that he was being placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full audit of his activities. That was the first crack in the dam. The second came from me. I placed the leather ledger on the table next to David's document. I told them quietly that this was a record of the $250,000 personal loan Harold had given them 2 years ago for a down payment. A loan I added on which they had never made a single payment. That's when Freya shattered. It wasn't a cry. It was a raw, guttural sob that seemed to tear itself from her throat. The carefully constructed facade of the perfect Malibu matriarch just crumbled into dust. She started yelling that I didn't understand, that it was all gone. The money, everything. She confessed that they were just trying to fix it. The whole sordid story tumbled out in a torrent of shame and terror. The stupid investment, the lies they told to cover it, the threatening calls from the people they owed money to, and underneath it all, the crushing, unbearable weight of their social standing about to be pulverized. Dean just stood there, his face ashen, the silent architect of their ruin. Freya's confession wasn't an apology to me. It was the sound of a soul surrendering to its own disaster. Their pathetic little conspiracy wasn't just fractured, it was annihilated. I looked at my daughter. Her face streaked with tears and mascara, and for a fleeting, painful moment, I saw the scared little girl she used to be. But the image vanished in an instant, replaced by the woman who had tried to strip me of my home, my husband's legacy, and my dignity. I stood up the power in the room, now entirely, unequivocally mine. My voice was cold and left no room for argument. I told them David would escort them out. I then informed them that we would have a final family meeting the next evening here at 6 o'clock sharp, and that they were to be on time. When they arrived at 6 o'clock the next evening, the living room was no longer a cozy family space. It was a boardroom. A courtroom. I had asked my brother Robert and his wife to be there. I needed outsiders, witnesses who weren't entangled in this mess. Freya and Dean shuffled in and sat huddled together on the far end of the sofa, looking small, pale, and utterly defeated. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out fear. David Chen sat beside me at the polished dining table, a neat stack of documents placed squarely in front of him. The thick manila envelope from Harold's safe lay in front of me. I let the heavy silence hang in the air for a long moment before I began. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke calmly, systematically, laying out the truth, brick by painful brick. I looked directly at Freya, my own daughter, and told her how she had isolated me, intercepted my calls, and lied to my friends. I described how she had me sign a document under false pretenses, a blatant attempt to gain power of attorney. As I spoke, David calmly slid a copy of the document I had signed across the table. I saw my brother's eyes widen in shock and dawning horror. I continued, my voice steady and cold. I told them I knew they did all this because they had lost their money in a foolish investment scheme and were now nearly $2 million in debt. At this, David placed a copy of the final demand letter from the recovery firm on the table. My sister-in-law let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The true punishment, I realized in that moment, wasn't going to come from me. It was in the horrified, deeply disappointed stare my brother was giving his niece. It was in the crushing shame that was radiating from Freya and Dean, an energy so potent it felt like a physical presence in the room. Their carefully curated world, their image of Malibu success, was being dismantled in front of an audience. Then I picked up the thick manila envelope Harold had left for me. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight. I told them my husband was a brilliant man, but more than that, he was a man who saw people for exactly who they were. I opened the clasp and pulled out the contents. It wasn't one document, it was several. The first was a freshly executed will, signed and notarized just a month before Harold's death, which explicitly and cleanly disinherited Freya. The second was a deed transferring full ownership of Sterling Construction into an ironclad trust with an independent, unmovable trustee, David Chen. And the third paper was the final, brutal masterstroke. It was a signed, sworn confession from the very man who had run the Ponzi scheme, a man Harold had apparently been investigating for months. The confession detailed every single investor he had scammed, including by name Freya and Dean. My voice softened with a wave of both grief and immense pride. I explained that Harold's last act on this earth was to protect his legacy from them. I then took the fraudulent power of attorney form, the one I had so foolishly signed, and slid it into a small paper shredder David had brought and placed on the floor beside me. The sound of the blades chewing through their betrayal was the only sound in the room. I looked at them one last time. I told them they had no power here. They had no inheritance. The house was mine. The company was secure. Then I stood up, signaling the end. The meeting was over. I told them to leave my house. After they left, the silence in the living room was deafening. My brother Robert just sat there for a long time, shaking his head. He and his wife came over and hugged me, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like I could finally breathe. The fallout from that night was immediate and absolute. Stripped of their expected inheritance and with their catastrophic debt now laid bare, Freya and Dean's world simply collapsed. I heard through Robert that they sold their cars first, then their over-leveraged house in a desperate scramble to pay off their most aggressive creditors. The social humiliation they had feared more than anything else came to pass, but not in the loud, dramatic way they might have imagined. They weren't gossiped about or reviled. They were simply erased. In the competitive, status-driven world of Malibu, they had committed the one unforgivable sin: they had failed. Dean, I was told, ended up taking a job with a small-time contractor out in the valley, a humiliating fall from grace. And Freya, the girl who dreamed of being the queen of the coast, was working as a personal shopper, a ghost haunting the edges of the very world she once tried so desperately to conquer. She never called, not once. I, on the other hand, began to live again. The very first thing I did the next morning was call my friend Carol and invite her for coffee. Soon the house that had been a gilded cage was once again filled with the warmth of genuine friendship and laughter. With David Chen's guidance, I took a more active role on the board of Sterling Construction. I started attending meetings, not just as a silent owner, but as a participant. I discovered a passion and an aptitude for the business Harold had so lovingly built, a strength I didn't know I possessed. My grief for my husband didn't disappear. I don't think it ever will, but it transformed. It settled into a quiet strength, a motivating force to honor his legacy by living my own life with purpose and integrity. About 6 months later, I was sitting on my patio, a cup of tea in my hands, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and violet. The Pacific Ocean, which had once seemed like a silent, indifferent witness to my pain, now felt like a promise of infinite possibility. I was not the fragile widow my daughter had tried to make me. I was the master of my own life, the guardian of Harold's legacy, and a woman who had faced the deepest betrayal and found not bitterness, but a profound and lasting peace. The house was no longer a cage. It was my sanctuary, a home bought and paid for, not just with money, but with wisdom. And I knew with a certainty that filled my heart that this strength, this peace, was Harold's truest final gift to me. Thelma's story teaches us that the most devastating betrayals are often born from a deep, corrosive fear of failure rather than simple malice. Her true victory wasn't just in the brilliant execution of her husband's final plan, but in her ability to protect his legacy and reclaim her own peace. She came to understand the tragedy of her daughter's desperation without allowing herself to become its final victim. In the end, she learned that the strongest walls are not built from anger, but from a quiet, unbreakable foundation of self-respect.